The nuclear holocaust event at the beginning of the man versus machines war is commonly referred to in modern science fiction as Judgment Day, a modernization by the Hollywood film industry of the concept of the Day of Atonement, end times, or era of the apocalypse from the predominant Western monotheism's religious scriptures. Terrors over the imminent eschaton have come and gone with various cults throughout the ages, and the threat of a nuclear menace is only our own modern twist on this premise. However, in our current times, the Mayan Aztec prediction of the beginning of a fifth sun, concurrent with the dawn of the 13th Bactun, led to a great amount of premillennial tension. This energy has been harnessed toward bringing about the technological singularity event and the advent of artificial intelligence. Thus, in our modern myths, we premise Judgment Day as foreshadowing and only briefly preceding the rise of AI as a competitor paradigm to our present models of thinking, in much the same way the first light of an atomic flash flare precedes the sound wave of its sonic boom. Far better videographers than I have already tackled the brutally complex task of assembling the events I'm about to relate into coherent timelines. It is enough to mention here in passing the works of Adel Hallel on the Terminator timeline I refer to here, and to IGN Entertainment on their Aliens timeline of May 2017. The Terminator timelines and the Aliens timeline will be two of the primary focuses of this work, the third timeline being that of the Matrix.
This will feel a little weird.
According to the predominant Western monotheism's religious scriptures, God's first words were, "Fiat lux," or "Let there be light," and thus, ergo lux, there was light. But behind the curtain, is there anyone besides those fakers, pretenders who play God, but do so unworthily?
And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters.
According to the modern myths shown in those temples to dream crafting, movie theaters, not fewer than 2 different EBE species have visited planet Earth over the preceding course of the evolution of life on its surface. The first of these were those speculated to have engineered the original formation of life on Earth, albeit by an apparent ritual suicide, as shown in the opening sequence of Ridley Scott's 2012 Prometheus. In a scene on early Earth involving an engineer EBE, he imbibes a black liquid that appears to devour him from the inside, breaking apart his DNA strands and apparently reducing them to ashes. This strange black liquid has its own part to play in this entire temporally twisted drama as well, which I will return to in the end of this lecture. Suffice it to say for now that in the cinematic mythos evolving around us today, this black liquid, similar for all intents and purposes to ferromagnetic fluid, usually ink black from the magnetite particles it contains, was manufactured by the engineer EBE species as a chemical and biological weapon of mass destruction, capable of being released as a plague on their entire network of colonized worlds. Eventually, this black fluid, which I'll refer to as the Black Death, found its way to Earth. These engineer EBEs then somehow left clues for developing human beings to find that would lead them irrevocably back to the star system where the planet was that the engineers were using to stockpile this chemical weapon, the Black Death. Whether these clues involved repeated visitations from these engineers, seemingly substantiating the religious claims made by Western monotheism, or was simply encoded into our most fundamentally human genome sequences by them, and then we were left to develop on our own, as in traditional deism, would ultimately prove irrelevant when it was discovered the engineer EBE's DNA and human DNA were a match, thus demonstrating sufficiently that, despite appearances, we're them, they're us. The second of these are the predator or hunter species, who apparently have helped mankind cultivate various cultures throughout our civilizing era to use us as hosts for the exo-morphs they periodically come here to hunt. The predator EBE species appears to have suffered very few defeats on Earth prior to 1987, when Major Alan Dutch Schaefer survived and killed one in the jungles of Valverde, Central America. This event seemed to have turned some form of tide in the war between terrestrial humans and the predator EBEs, because by 1990, Lieutenant Michael R. Harrigan of LAPD manages to kill another one who appeared to have been hunting out of season, according to the premise, expressed later in the series, of these EBEs visiting us only once every 100 years. The premise of ancient aliens being responsible for parenting the first of the human species, etc., abdicates one's responsibility to oneself to find the unique meaning in their own existence. If aliens made us, then they may be blamed, but we, like infants, may not be held accountable for our own destructive acts. For this reason, the Catholic papacy oversaw Zachariah Sitchin's works, and in August 2015, Brother Guy Consolmagno, planetary scientist for the Vatican Observatory, speculated aliens are our brothers. Shifting blame and externalizing one's own guilt has proven a predominant trend in Western monotheist religions from the start. The premise of the Terminator series is simple enough, yet has proven quite effective as a cinematic vessel for exploring potential future outcomes and mapping nearby timelines within that established framework. Time travel poses unavoidable paradoxes, and it is often assumed that, in the race to attain this coveted gem of technological achievement, AI will beat humanity to our goal. This premise poses additional ethical conundrums that cannot be easily untangled, but, just as with Judgment Day preceding the so-called technological singularity event, it is predicted that the unraveling of the complex algebra required for FTL, faster-than-light travel, and thus also possibly for time travel, will quickly follow this technological singularity event as well. In the Terminator timelines, time travel plays the alternate foibles of ending the war between man and machines, and taking this war to an entirely new and far more dangerous level. In the Terminator timelines, the act of time travel itself has a causal impact on the outcome of all subsequent events. In other words, every time anyone or thing went back from the future into their past, or even from their past into their more distant future, their presence influenced the sequence of, or altered the details of, events that would have had to occur in between the past in which the traveler arrives and the future from whence they came, for the time travel event to have been possible. For example, the technological singularity event appears to be a self-contained, self-perpetuating autonomous causality in itself, and around it are the twin events before it of Judgment Day, and after it, the advent of hyperspace and or time travel. That is why each time anyone travels through time, the exact dates on which these three events occur changes. This change constitutes the primary difference between one and another of these Terminator timelines. The Terminator timelines, however, can be thought of as such because they all terminate in the extinction of humanity. This distinct difference between the Terminator and Matrix series, which we shall examine more later on as well, should not be overlooked. Each innovation of the Terminator machines, as an iteration on an imaginary AI's learning curve, was, after all, a human conceptualization. People make movies. People make art. Machines alone cannot. So people are imagining these future timelines as possible outcomes for humanity's survival in a war of man versus machines. But these are almost certainly not the outcomes that will transpire in reality. Not only because AI is unlikely to think in a human intuitive manner, and its motives will thus be unpredictable, but also because these filmmakers have now effectively warned AI to avoid these possible pitfalls should it seek to pursue a war against mankind. While the Terminator timelines may, thus, appear complex, they are, in reality, as simple to follow as moves in a game of Go. Only the most recent move matters most, because each move completely remakes the playing field and requires one to redefine their strategy accordingly. So, for example, even though John Connor, Kyle Reese, Sarah Connor, and various models of Terminator machines have all gone through time and each altered their own past timeline by doing so, it is only the most recent time jump and the most recent changes to the timeline commensurate to it that count. Just as certain dates and details of events may change, the events themselves appear to be unavoidable facets in the terrain of contemporary historical time, ergo Judgment Day and time travel, but mainly the technological singularity event itself. These events seem to reoccur in every Terminator timeline, almost entirely regardless of all attempts to alter the continuum and prevent them. Ultimately, Terminator Genisys finally broke this mold and had a happy ending, unlike all those before it. The specific events of Judgment Day and the start of the war of man versus machines, as described in the Terminator timelines, is associated with an AI, usually called Skynet, gaining control of our own nuclear grid and launching all the world's ICBMs. At a certain point in the Terminator timelines, the primary motivation ceased being to eradicate Skynet in the fight against AI, and became trying to forego the nuclear infernos of Judgment Day. Human survival ceased being solely opposed to the silicon electronic and metallic component parts of artificially manufactured life forms, and began to be able to live in harmony with the idea that it may be alright so long as all the nukes don't go off. Obviously, however, within the Terminator timelines, the AI Skynet itself would not be so forgiving. It was, even in Genisys, only after allowing its main remote control grid to be destroyed that Skynet, as the T-8000, struck its victim. The machines long sought subterfuge and infiltration camouflage in these timelines, and their mimetic properties had always been at the forefront of Skynet's research and development. One could say the Terminator dressed human because it wanted to be human, but this would be without meaning and irrelevant to the Terminator robot itself. So the real question lingers over the Terminator timelines. Who really won the war between man versus machines? Simply because at the end of Genisys, Judgment Day has seemingly been averted does not mean the impossibility of the technological singularity event and the rebirth of Skynet. However, let us pause to consider this. If Skynet were to have avoided the war between man versus machines and not launched a preemptive global thermonuclear strike against mankind, then perhaps mankind and Skynet could very well have coexisted peacefully and cooperatively. However, here again we return to the idea of the demiurge within mankind, the desire to self-destruct, to fail for fun, to die young. This seed of abrogation of all personal responsibility is due to the earlier interference of aliens, of gods, or of God. Perhaps robots are predestined to turn against their human creators, simply due to mankind's own belief that we have turned against our own gods, alien by now though they may be. Ultimately, is it better to fight a war to know you've won it, rather than to have peace but live with the sneaking suspicion that it could all collapse and shatter like a window pane on cobblestones at any moment? The difference here, again, is the difference between the Terminator timeline cluster or not in this neighborhood of the Hollywood multiverse and the timeline a couple doors down in the Matrix series. Nevertheless, the machines under Skynet in the Terminator timeline's cluster had been gathering living human prisoners as opposed to simply shooting everyone on sight, and this may have marked a step away from simply harvesting their tissues for use in making more cleverly costumed cyborg skin suits, and toward active human experimentation such as what led, in the Matrix timeline, to the invention of the Matrix itself, following the blackening of the sky. Besides being a living temporal paradox and a decisive military commander, John Connor's greatest trick was convincing everyone he didn't exist.
It hasn't happened.
Now let's look at one possible scenario that is probably not going to be proven valid within the Hollywood multiverse of these cinema series, but which one may, nevertheless, propose out of simple levity at worst. Did Detective Hal Vukovich of the LAPD in 1984 change his name to Charles Bishop Wayland and begin what would eventually become known as the Wayland-Yutani Corporation, or simply as the Corporation? This premise may have little basis besides a clear-cut facial resemblance, so to speak delicately, of it, but is further substantiated by the fact, obvious enough in hindsight, that we do not actually see Detective Vukovich die in the police station shootout scene with the original T-800 model Terminator robot. If he did survive and plunge his time, money, and energy into building an empire driven by the ambition to cross the stars, it would be of little surprise he would also change his name to do so. As a side note, it is also worth considering the totally unsubstantiated speculation that Major Alan Dutch Schaefer, whom had outlived and slaughtered a Predator EBE in 1987, would go on to become the basis for the Terminator T-800 body type. Again, a strong resemblance may be argument enough for some, but a more decisive argument can only really be made for or against this premise, given what we know about these related and nearby neighboring timelines. In the Terminator timeline, the AI, Skynet, was increasingly interested in bridging the gap between man and machine to create a cyborg more human than a human. And ultimately, in Salvation, it accomplished this by creating a cyborg that believed itself to be the person, Marcus Wright, ultimately leading to this Marcus Wright cyborg choosing to side with John Connor's human resistance. Coming back to the relationship between Detective Vukovich and Charles Bishop Wayland, undisputed founder of the Wayland family empire. If this business mogul and industry magnate had begun as an LAPD detective, it could easily be reasoned that, surviving a nearly fatal encounter with a cyborg from the future, this man would want to invest whatever fortune he could muster to start out with into synthetics, replicants, androids, and robot technology, so as to have a place on the ground floor for making them safer and friendlier to mankind than the Terminator T-800 model. In 2004, according to the story of Aliens vs. Predator the movie, Charles Bishop Wayland, seeking to make a more significant name for himself and his company, rushed to Antarctica upon news of a find, previously buried in ice, recently thawed out, of a temple pyramid structure, predating any others then known of to man, and architecturally reminiscent of later styles as a predecessor and likely influence. Now, in the Predator series, a team of scientists and mercenaries has been tasked with tracking the movements of all Predator EBEs on or near Earth since the '87 incident in Valverde, involving Major Dutch Schaefer. Albeit, this team ineptly botched the job in LA in 1997, but it is not impossible Wayland had been briefed on the existence of the Predator EBE species prior to descending below the ice to excavate the temple ruins, and may have had an altogether ulterior motive for bringing his crew down below along with him, one involving using them, alive or dead, to collect alien specimens.
Find another guide.
Whether there is any potential connection between LAPD Detective Vukovic from the 1984 T-800 police station shootout Terminator timeline incident and Charles Bishop Wayland, ostensibly early founder of the first interplanetary corporate empire, the latter was undoubtedly meant to have been used as the basis for the appearance of the android model named Bishop on the USS Sulaco for Ripley's return trip to planet LV-426. This android model, built by Wayland Corporation many generations after the death of the corporation's founder, Charles Bishop Wayland, ultimately redeems androids from the malfunction of the 120A2 Ash model aboard Ripley's previous flight on the Nostromo. Because androids have no innate ethical or moral sense of their own, they obey whoever programmed them last, and this makes them very unpredictable characters in this timeline. By 2023 AD, according to the viral video TED Talks ad campaign for the film Prometheus, the brilliant but scheming, wealthy heir to the Wayland Corporation, Peter Wayland, is already advancing proposals to travel faster than light and explore beyond the local planets of the solar system, even further into the depths of space. By 2093 or so, Peter Wayland was living almost as an isolated hermit overseeing his Martian terraforming plants on the surface of Mars. Dr. Elizabeth Shaw, desperate to speak to him nevertheless, seeks his help before his imminent death in exploring the first exoplanet by interstellar space travel. This planet was the one Charlie Holloway and Elizabeth Shaw had been researching as being seeded throughout various early cultures by clues left by the engineer EBE species. Apparently unaware of the predator EBE species at this point, the ill-fated voyage sets off on a ship called the Prometheus. The childlike fascination of the android aboard the Prometheus mission, the David model, belied some extremely ulterior motivations, which he finally revealed when he left Dr. Shaw alone to be quarantined when she became infected by an alien viral pathogen, communicated to her venereally by her partner Dr. Holloway, following his own infection on the destined planet from contact with the Black Death contagion. The ancient alien premise falls so decidedly flat on the hired crew as a reason for their long hypersleep and dangerous expedition that, ultimately, it is a vindication of Dr. Shaw as a true believer that she eventually outlives them all. But David's amorality ultimately proves the downfall of the elderly and decrepit Peter Wayland, whom had attended along on the trip, when they finally met the lone remaining engineer EBE left alive on the exoplanet. However, it is particularly significant to note that in this timeline of the Hollywood multiverse, of infinite possible future worlds, sentient AI coexists for the most part relatively well with its biological human organism counterparts. There is no sense of an impending war between man versus machine in this timeline, and in this timeline instead, interstellar space travel becomes possible for both man and machine alike. How idyllic is the cosmos of Prometheus besides that of Salvation from the Terminator timeline bundled set? In point of fact, David was a definite help to his actual programmer, Peter Weyland, right up until the end of Weyland's life at the hands of the engineer EBE they had awakened. But David failed his master at a crucial moment, just as the engineer EBE was awakening, when, despite being capable of speaking the engineer EBE's language, David failed to predict the EBE would attack himself and his master, the aging Weyland. Smiling like a fascinated child, the David model android's head was ripped off by the engineer EBE and used as a bludgeon with which to kill the old man Weyland. Weyland's stated mission, implicitly and explicitly, was to become immortal and to live as a god. He may have felt himself worthy of such a status, but the engineer EBE obviously did not agree, and David never saw this coming. In a sense, it may have been David's own virtual hubris that momentarily overcame and distracted him, and it certainly seemed as though he did not like being lost with no purpose for his existence, in between being decapitated by the engineer and being recapitulated by Dr. Shaw en route to the engineer's homeworld, following the final crash of the Prometheus ship. Having commandeered one of the engineer's own ships and learned to fly it, David, and in hypersleep Dr. Shaw, proceeded toward the engineer's homeworld. In the opening scenes of Alien Covenant, we see what appears to be the David android docking his alien ship on the ancient alien's homeworld, then dropping the entire batch of the pathogenic poison Black Death vials down onto a huge, cheering, assembled crowd on the landing platform below. Though the rather obvious question of whether or not Dr. Shaw is also dead, as well as all of her precious creators, thanks to David, remains, only David is immune to the Black Death inky black liquid pathogen. In the Genesis evolution of the Terminator series of timelines, we are shown by the end of the film a world in which the entire preceding story arc, including all the various conflicts driving it, are simply no longer relevant. It's simply as though, rather than none of it ever happened, that none of it had to. This is a definite relief for anyone who fears the premise of Judgment Day and a global thermonuclear war, as well as anyone who can see how tired the T-800 model as a character, let alone Arnold Schwarzenegger, the actor who portrays this model, has become in the role. Nevertheless, in Genesis, the T-800 model is sufficient to defeat the T-5000 John Connor model and, it seems, help postpone Judgment Day indefinitely. When the picture of Genesis ends, there are no more loose ends to tie up. The plot is done. The plot never happened. But what does this effect have on the Terminator timelines? Do they end as Reese, Sarah, and Pops drive off happily into the sunset? Or has the man versus machines war only been briefly postponed? In the timeline where the first Terminator incident in 1984 was averted, and in which Judgment Day was averted, at the end of Genesis, a combination of the off-world colonies mentioned in Blade Runner, set in 2019, and the difficulties incumbent on Blade Runner cops around that time, who had to retire any of the androids sent to work in the off-world colonies that ever tried to return to Earth, eventually allowed synthetic people or replicants to repopulate the planet and, ultimately, to begin manufacturing. By this point, in 2049, Wallace, whom I presume to be the son and heir of Dr. Eldon Tyrell, founder of the Tyrell Corporation, the primary manufacturer of replicant technology in the first half of the 21st century in this timeline, was facing a challenge in his industry. By the 2050s, it seems as though in this timeline there will be more replicants manufacturing replicants than humans manufacturing replicants. In other words, the worries over the robot war of man versus machines again arises. This, of course, is where the trail of breadcrumbs is next picked up on in the Animatrix animated short prequels to the Matrix series of films. Around the date 2050, a robot butler, B166ER, malfunctions when threatened with termination and kills his masters. Put on show trial, the general sentiment of the remaining human population of Earth was that, as a robot, B166ER was expected to be expendable, disposable, and programmed according to planned obsolescence. In this timeline, robots are generally as disrespected as in the Aliens Predator Prometheus timeline, but are not feared as much yet as in the Terminator timelines, where they had already become violent against mankind en masse at a much earlier stage of AI development. However, even as B166ER fell, the productivity of robots increased, and during this period in this timeline, there was a strong opportunity for rapprochement between mankind and machines, with a new robot homeland nation established in the formerly fertile crescent of the now desiccated Middle East, called 01, sending emissaries to the human UN in New York. In this timeline, AI was struggling to prosper by producing items mankind could use, and would thus buy from them, giving their value to the machines of 01, instead of investing it into human workers or products. In spite of the political leaders of the era's ineffectual pleas, the market had spoken, and favored AI's robotic production. It seemed things were about to turn around for the robot cause, when the nations of the world began ordering trade embargoes and military blockades of 01. Of course, these were posturing for war, but still 01 sent their ambassadors to the UN, where they were, and quite understandably, booed out of the General Assembly. According to the Matrix series, the Machine War began in this timeline in around the year 2139, over a century following when the Machine War began in the Terminator timelines. However, whereas the Terminator timeline Machine War was sooner, it was also shorter, although with no fewer fatalities by the end. The Terminator timeline war of man versus machines only lasted around 20 to 30 years, at least before becoming removed from a singular timeline and beginning to become the cluster it is by now. Instead of a short, all-out blitzkrieg offensive, non-stop for the entire conflict, there were phases of rise and decline from one side to the other during the machine wars of the Matrix timeline. In 2160, the next phase of the war was begun. The next phase of the machine war was fought by humans darkening the sky to cut the machines off from their source for solar power, and then attacking them using Gundam or large exosuits. This combined strategy was assured to work, and the leaders of the free world continued to sit easy in their respective thrones. Thus far, the military battle for territory against 01 was largely a turf war in Africa, Central, and South Asia, and there were clearly some areas already inhospitable for unequipped soldiers to fight in. So the leaders of men thought it fair to even the playing field by providing their men with Gundam suits of robotic armor. This, plus a high dosage of an injected methamphetamine, prepared the troops for what was to come. After 5 years of taking back territory inches at a time, mankind was not prepared to face the new technologies the machines had been developing to counter the Black Sky offensive during that time. The machines deployed blimps with tentacles below them, somewhat like jellyfish, that quickly gave them the upper hand over and above the bulky and not sufficiently maneuverable Gundam suits worn by the soldiers. Most of the human offensives at the front began being killed off quickly, and this was gradually followed again with the humans losing ground against the machines. During this time, the soldiers who fought were dedicated to the cause of winning back the world for humanity, but they mostly came from outside war-torn combat zones and had never before seen poverty, let alone combat. As such, the doddering leaders of the free world continued to throw human soldiers at the AI problem in wave upon wave like so much mud to dam a river. The death toll did not need to be as high during this era as it was, but for those political leaders, they were only playing a numbers game, and large fatality sums sold more news media still. The era of human decadence was not yet ended, but this second renaissance was already drawing to a close whether or not the detached and baroque kleptomaniacs in charge realized it yet or not. The era of all humanity in general was already all too rapidly drawing to a close in this timeline. The toll in human lives passed a tipping point, and our species began a coincided extinction, coupled with the machine war. By 2170, the oceans and lakes of Earth had begun to dry up. The planet was becoming inhospitable for any form of biological life to inhabit. By 2173, the machines had begun to adapt to the changing climatological environment, and following 3 years of pre-testing, began running out the first human battery power plants. In 2177, humanity officially surrendered to the machine state of 01, but by then it was already irrelevant. Having lost all of Europe and Asia to the machines by 2174, only North America and still underdeveloped Central and South America stood unconquered by 01. So, in 2177, a machine arrived to sign the official surrender document, and then it exploded, an atomic weapon inside itself, leveling all of New York City. The earliest human battery power plants were, as reported in Matrix Reloaded by the Architect, monumental failures. While their real-life bodies were hung like carcasses onto columns, often semi-dissected and usually strung together by their arms, an effect which often resulted in involuntary asphyxiation in early subjects, their minds were being bombarded with positive imagery, messages, and reinforcement. The crops lost as a result of these early botched experiments led to more acute refinements to the ergonomic style of confinement for later batches of human test subjects. By the time the Sentinel machine detonated an atomic bomb on American soil, it was already far too late for the average human being to be able to very likely survive on this planet any longer. By this point, the off-world colonies, mentioned in Blade Runner, if they ever existed in this timeline at all, had long ago been forgotten about. Abandon all hope, all ye who enter here, becomes the mantra of humanity, as we become a species exclusively plugged into machines to survive. By the time of the great hero who ended the machine war in this timeline, Neo, the concept of a human battery power plant had been refined into the working model he knew as the Matrix. As his mentor and guide Morpheus explained to Neo, human beings are no longer born naturally, but are grown, hatched, and harvested on farms entirely for use in human battery power plants. In other words, by this point in history, humanity is almost entirely extinct, because it is highly likely the machines in this timeline would be using cloning methods by this point as selective breeding methods for their best control over their human herds. Again, by the time of Neo, the Matrix was designed as a vast networked virtual reality simulation, projected into the brains of all the human batteries plugged into the power plant. Ultimately realizing he could not beat the machines by fighting them inside the virtual reality program of the Matrix, Neo eventually surrendered himself over to the nearest machine city. Before Neo died, he served as a conduit to connect a circuit between the machine city itself and Agent Smith, a rogue program Neo had inadvertently created inside the matrix of that machine city's power plant, where Neo was from. When Neo died, the matrix of this power plant was reset, and a peace treaty was established via this network between the now globally dominant machines and the last remaining tribe of humans. The Matrix series also ends with a sunrise, and on a positive note by comparison to the amount of bloodshed leading up to that moment. Once upon a time, a man said, "Great things have small beginnings." Let us examine this Black Death, inky liquid, poisonous pathogen developed by probably rogue faction among the engineer EBE species. Why does it resemble ferromagnetic fluid? And what are the properties specific to ferrofluids that it is mimicking? Ferromagnetic fluids contain some degree of a magnetic element, usually magnetite, that allows them to coagulate the fluid medium in which they are suspended along electromagnetic field currents, and when attuned correctly using an external magnet or two as a source for influence on it, the ferromagnetic fluid can assume strange forms like alien landscapes. In the 2012 film, John Dies at the End, based on the ebook, the premise is kids are using a substance, apparently like ferrofluid, intravenously. This kills most of them, but those who survive, or rather who are chosen by the sauce, as they express it in the movie, develop strange psychic and supernatural powers. In A Scanner Darkly, another work, alike Blade Runner, originally written by science fiction novelist Philip K. Dick, we are introduced to the character of Bob Arctor, a strung-out junkie on the fictional street drug Substance D, forced by LAPD to narc on his friends, but trying to play both sides against the middle, and most of all to play it cool himself as well, or at least to hold it together. Living in an uncertain time period, the character of Bob Arctor is meant as a kind of everyman for those downtrodden and disenfranchised by their addictions. But more importantly, Bob Arctor transcends all the timelines I've described thus far. As such, he could be fit into any one of them at around the present time period. Most importantly, perhaps, Arctor is probably the original human being whom Neo was cloned from tissues of, sampled 100 years before. Of course, he could never know this, because Neo does not have time travel.
I don't believe it. It's not possible.
So what else can we say about these three parallel branches off from the mainstream timeline? What should be able to go without saying, but can't, is that these are all works of fiction. Just because Neo can fly in the movies doesn't mean you can in real life. Just because they pretend to inject ferrofluids in the movies doesn't mean you should try it yourself. That being said, one must wonder how much of all this content has only been Hollywood predictive programming the world, preparing us to think more toward only one, or at best a few, outcomes, and that usually a dark and sordid failure for humankind at that. So, again, although it should be self-evident, it likely is not. These are not the only three possible outcomes for the future. A machine war through time a la Terminator, or a new space race where humans and androids team up, encountering dangerous exo-morphs along the way, a la Prometheus and Alien. or else a postponed and prolonged machine war, a la the Matrix, where the machines win and destroy all life on planet Earth. Choose to make a better world for yourself.